I'm excited now to introduce our next speaker, Maia Kotrosits, who is giving a talk entitled The Matter of Form, Rewriting Our Way to a Changed Field. Maia Kotrosits works at the intersection of ancient Christian studies, classics, contemporary cultural studies, and the study of religion. Her most recent books are The Lives of Objects, Material Culture Experience, the Real in the History of Early Christianity, and that was published in 2020, and History, Theory, and the Study of Religion in Late Antiquity, which recently came out in 2023. She has taught at Amherst College and Denison University and is currently a visiting scholar at the University of Toronto. And again, the title of her talk is The Matter of Form, Rewriting Our Way to a Changed Field. Please take it away, Maia.
Hi, all. So I'm a little bit under the weather. So excuse me if you see me sipping tea or, grabbing a cough drop every once in a while. I'll start with a quote from Diane Seuss, the poet. "The sonnet, like poverty, teaches you what you could do without." She writes this in the first line of one of her poems from her Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Frank Sonnets. So Seuss writes ambivalently here of what we call just as ambivalently, the enabling constraint of form, the discipline of restriction that teaches you to make something with what is there. Seuss may be ambivalent, but she's not romantic about the enabling constraint of form since she pairs it with poverty. Her own literal poverty is some of the content that fills out the form of this memoir in sonnets. In this book, Seuss coaxes both memoir and sonnet as forms past their more recognizable selves towards almost perilous new depths, as she writes with unvarnished candor about her son's addiction, the deaths of loved ones, and the idiosyncratic landscape of rural Michigan. Her sonnets all have 14 lines, but they aren't written in iambic pentameter, and they don't end in rhymed couplets. Seuss strips down the sonnet to see what it can do. But what the sonnet can do is always weighed down a little bit by the encumbrances of doing without. I've often thought about academic forms as constraint, articles, monographs, book reviews, and I've often thought about those constraints as enabling. Indeed, my own story of becoming an academic is tied to this ambivalent need to structure my experience of the world, experience which was at the time both visceral and protean, an unstable substance. I needed more language quickly. I needed containers badly, and I got them. But right now, what I mean by academic form is something bigger than genre, although inclusive of it. I mean form of thought, such as rationalist discourse, reasoned, dispassionate, evidentiary argumentation. I mean the norms of citation, which can do iterative storytelling and policing of intellectual histories. I also mean the prestige economy of knowledge production, the way epistemological weight accrues to prestige presses, publications, and institutions, and all that foundationalizes. So when I say I want to reflect on the constraints of academic form, when I say I want to ask what exactly they enable, I mean I want to ask what they enable at what cost. What is, shall we say, their poverty? What's more, I want to play with the terminology of formal constraint as enablement in writing and turn it around, and to reverse the terms and suggest disablement, expansively defined, as having the potential to bend, loosen, or even shatter formal constraints in academic writing. Formal constraints that are, in actuality, relational constraints. And here the term constraints perhaps even seems too light. Inasmuch as forms formalize relationships, relationships to others, relationships to time, to that which we study, to the world, forms are social architecture. Formal constraints are constraints of thought and of possibility. So in the course of this reflection, I'll be drawing on some work in the cultural studies wing of Black studies and disability studies / crip theory, and sharing my own experience in order to begin a consideration of why and how we might depart from doctrinal and normative academic forms of thought. So we implicitly think of justice in academic criticism and history in terms of content. We fill traditional academic forms with better, more just ideas, more just and more accurate pictures of history, for instance. We interrogate power relations and our stories about the past. We choose our sources thoughtfully. We think more critically about whose work we read and who we cite and why. And we call that work ethical. And of course it is. At the same time, and related to this understanding of our work as content, we're working in the middle of a fairly vast content machinery driven by ubiquitous corporatization. It is the constant demand for material, both scholarly and pedagogical, for various academic benchmarks and evaluations, to serve students as consumers or to maintain competitiveness in a historically brutal job market. It's also social media culture with its constantly moving feeds, its character limits, its bite-sized, instantly legible takes. This is machinery indulging in the constant lure and, quote, suicidal cycle of the new. That's Ariella Azoulay. That is really variations of the same. Machinery that enlists intellectual work that is reproducible or extractable, a theory or skills that can be applied, for instance, or information that can be used or useful. Creativity that is digestible, recuperable, evaluable. Machinery that enlists our students, their attentions, and their labors into this cycle of content production and assessment. Machinery that polices the limit and demands work that you can take in quickly and assess easily, using ready-at-hand rubrics, whether in the classroom or the review process. The pace of this content machine is fast. Its demands are terse. Its demands are also tense. Its demands are terse and its patience short. There is very little time in the content machine. The logic of content is commodifying logic. It produces thought as commodity, as fungible. Commodity that we can own or consume, that can be branded or marketed on the internet to sell ourselves to institutions, etc. We become product. We become spokesperson for a theory or an idea. And thought becomes substance, currency, social or cultural capital, citable, quotable, usable, rather than thought as possibility, or again, thought as relation. We get worn down, understandably, from questioning the form or sponsoring venue of our expression in the face of the demand to simply produce more content, better content, even in some cases, more ethical content. But this wearing down is dangerous. It's dangerous because it is exactly in the isolation of content from form or venue, without any scrutiny about the kinds of relationships produced and reproduced in those forms and venues, that the ethics of any content that we might produce meet their limit. It mimics the logic of diversity without justice, for instance, in which the identities of the participants in the institutions and structures might become various, but the institutions and structures themselves remain strategically intractable. So for me, the question of academic form is, at least in part, a question of how to get outside the commodification of thought and how to more fully embrace thought as unfolding and destabilizing process, as stretching toward a different experiencing of the world and a different set of relations. So these questions became most poignant to me under several corroborating and interlinked conditions in which I was forced to encounter the limits of forms. Both in terms of genre and in terms of cognition and perception and assessment. I offer this set of experiences not as some expression of true knowledge or even a definitive realization of any sort, but more as an extended and intense moment of difficulty, in the vein of the conference, that is epistemologically rich. So these are the circumstances. First, the pandemic and its irrevocable revelation of the violence of the normal, as poet Dion Brand named it. Second, and these are all related, my own long period of poor health, some related to long COVID after March of 2020, including chronic, almost daily migraines for several years, and the chronic pain of one of my closest friends, who is also an academic, as we tried and often failed to navigate our reading and writing in ways that had integrity for us and also met the demands of our careers. Third, the conditions of teaching in university settings in which students found themselves profoundly exhausted by, struggling against, and captive to the commodification and contentification of education from all angles. Not only in terms of being captive to the paradigm of acquiring packageable, marketable skills, of course, but in terms of their own commodified and consumerist presence in higher ed. So I just think IA plagiarism is like a clear symptom of these conditions. AI allows students to enact explicitly their condition of commodified anonymity with the production of blank and fungible content. So these were entangled conditions of disability, impairment, and debilitation. My colleague and I were unable, for several reasons, to produce our usual scholarly content. We're not alone there, obviously. I with my brain fog and migraines, she with her chronic pain and exhaustion. At many points, us with our pandemic anxiety as well. So my students were also debilitated with any number of things, including under the conditions of forced carrying on of business as usual, even while the circumstances of the world and their understandings of it, not to mention the details of their own lives, were radically revising themselves. And my students at that time, and I mean, this is still now, right? This is all still applicable, but this is was acute, particularly in the first year of the pandemic. My students had generally lost their ability to do the kinds of reading that they had always done in the ways that they had always done it. Most of them had trouble concentrating. They couldn't retain information in quite the same way, etc. A familiar story. And so I'll clarify my description of these conditions as disability, impairment, and debilitation. So I evoke debilitation in this broadened way, not to undercut or erase the conditions that we conventionally house under disability. Rather, I do so to change the frame away from identity-based analytics that have historically dominated disability studies as an institutionalized discipline. So Jasbir Puar, for instance, has used the term debilitation to denote the slow wearing down of populations instead of the event of becoming disabled. Puar also uses debility in order to name conditions and effects that don't qualify under the very racialized recognition politics of disability as identity. So for Puar, disability signals an exceptional condition of a subject, one seeking accommodation and inclusion. So that's the liberal rights seeking subject, while debility signals a set of social, cultural, and political conditions whose quote unquote normal consequences are the unexceptional attrition and injury of psyches and bodies. So the carceral state, late capitalist labor exploitation, exhaustion, because of labor exploitation, militarization, environmental poisoning, these are some of her most poignant examples. So debility, precisely because it is so quotidian and because it's classed and it's racialized, never reaches the echelons of state or social recognition, in part because it's constitutive of biopolitical state regimes. So on the term impairment, Jonathan Stern has taken up the term impairment to similarly critique this disabled, non-disabled binary. And that's what debility is also doing. Which inadvertently naturalizes institutional diagnoses, as well as the social constructions of the whole body that can become disabled. So Stern writes about impairment as something all of us experience at one point or another to different extents, and he writes about it as a quality of experience, and he wants to describe it phenomenologically. So I employ debility and debilitation and impairment to think, again, more expansively than disability, and to draw our gaze toward the conditions that are endlessly enervating populations, exhausting them, or us, damaging and impeding them, as well as to draw attention to those limits in mind-body experience that we regularly encounter to different extents in different ways as a condition of being alive. But in asking about debility, impairment, and disability and form, the proposition is not negative. It's not how conditions of disability and debility and impairment inhibit. So I'm not asking how to recuperate debility and re-enter the process of production and contentification. Because in actuality, it's the very process of contentification of thought that is inhibitive and prohibitive. Rather, the formulation here is how impairment and debilitation can interrupt and how they enable other possibilities for thinking. So when we're incapacitated from the consumption and production cycle of content, we have to think and respond and relate in other ways. So the story of figuring out how to respond in terms of making and breaking forms to my students' debilitation is not one story, but many. So I'm not telling that. I'm telling my own story for the moment. It made more sense to share that. So over this strange extended time of brain fog and anxiety and chronic migraines, I felt like I lived in a cave. My pre-migraine state was a sense of encroaching doom, this kind of tornado in the distance feeling, and the brain fog was a wall. So cognitive clarity was not in the cards. Time stretched and collapsed, fully captive to it all, but needing to metabolize my experience and still preoccupied with the past and its literature, as always. I found myself starting to write from this state of mind, one in which the long past and the present were blurred. And so often the language that came to me to express this experience of time was fragmentary and oblique. Its closest form was lines of poetry. I had majored in creative writing in college and wrote poetry, but hadn't really written it in the 20 years intervening. So over a longer period of 2 to 3 years, until my migraines became more manageable, I found myself doing writing along two streams. First, some of the more familiar academic writing, and second, this growing collection of these little pieces of fragmentary writings. They were hard to classify, but they felt associatively close to one another. And all of the work was invested in roughly the same themes, this, late ancient Christianity, imperialism, colonialism, hagiography. But the relationship between the more traditional work I did and the more experimental work I did was pretty tense because it felt like it was being written by two different people. The formal work was written by someone whose memory and cognition were sharp, because I could only do that work when I was not in this tunnel of pain. That writer was somebody who could schematize, who could organize, write clear segues, use very professional vocabulary. The other work was written by someone in this kind of dreamlike haze, someone in proximity always to pain, who wrote by association and metaphor, whose associations were sordid, but sometimes quite electric. She was immersed, both more deeply in the present and more deeply in the past. Her writing was economical, condensed out of necessity, because she had no energy for long description. She was less coded, more direct. And whatever the writing was, it was not dry. So it felt necessary at some point to give this writer in pain her due, not least because she dominated my experience for a few years. It felt necessary to find a way to understand that work that I was doing as legitimate, because it occurs to me how easy it is to write off the work I did in pain. It's associative, it's immersive, it's unpredictable. And that work is generally classed not as historical, but as interpretive work, something like reception or, like just a contrast to history, even if that work is done by the same person with the same expertise over the same period of time. And the reason it gets written off is because of the over-identification of the work of professionalized history and critique with rationalism and rationalist discursive modes, which are characterized by a performed analytical distance, by categorical distinctions, by taxonomic, genealogical, evaluative thinking. It's also because of the neurotypicality of the academic world and the world at large, which authorizes certain cognitive modalities, certain modes of perception to the exclusion of others. So we must ask what is at stake in these dominant cognitive and perceptive modalities. Lamar Jarrell Bruce's book, How to Go Mad Without Losing Your Mind, Madness and Black Radical Creativity, offers us one answer, as he explores the whiteness and anti-Blackness of rationalism. Bruce writes about what he calls, quote, Black madness, in other words, forms of creativity and expression that are pathologized and foreclosed by the world, understood as angry, subrational, crazy. And he draws from figures from history and fiction alike. And he connects these kinds of madness with the Black radical tradition, thus connecting Black madness with art, survival, thriving, and the political field. Black madness appears for him as, quote, content, form, symbol, idiom, aesthetic, existential posture, philosophy, strategy, and energy, unquote. The edge of his critique, importantly, is how in normative Western philosophy since the Age of Enlightenment, quote, reason and rationality are believed essential for achieving modern personhood, joining civil society, and participating in liberal politics. However, reason, he continues, has been entangled from those very Enlightenment roots with misogynist, colonialist, ableist, anti-Black, and other pernicious ideologies. Reason was associated with freedom, and the notion of freedom in modernity, as Saidiya Hartman and Lisa Lowe have shown, was always tied to conditions of colonialism and enslavement. Enslavement was the ontological foil, essentially, for the rational subject. Neurotypicality is no less racialized than rationalism. In her book, For a Pragmatics of the Useless, Erin Manning takes on the ways whiteness articulates itself in proximity to or as neurotypicality, for instance, in its obsession with individualist independence. Neurotypicality for Manning can be understood best through some of its most prized processes and routines. Those seem to be lacking in those who are neurodivergent. But therein lies the problem, as Manning writes elsewhere. Quote, neurotypicality is an unspoken but commonly practiced wager that frames knowledge in advance of any question of where else knowing is at work, unquote. One of the primary hallmarks of neurotypicality is executive function, with its procedural orientation that habitually subtracts elements from their environment in order for planning to take place. In other words, it is perceptive subtraction selection from a sensory ecology. It is evaluative. Even aside from the corporate spookiness of the term executive function, the valuation of executive function crowds out the perceptive and relational possibilities of something like autistic perception. The tendencies of autistic perception are toward, in Manning's description, an intense feeling with the world, a more sensorial, ecological, textural participation in the world, rather than selectively interpersonal modalities. Autistic perception does not background elements, and its sociality is oblique, askew. And Manning finds kinship between this ecological and social ambiguity and the blur of Black sociality theorized in Fred Moten's work. Both Manning and Bruce argue for the creativity and perceptive intelligence of those working or cast outside of the norms of rationalism and neurotypicality. But importantly, neurotypicality and rationalism are operations, and thus not necessarily ones those classed within normative categories are bound to or even capable of upholding as often as they are expected to. In an article called Brain Fog, The Race for Cripistemology, Mel Chen relates experiences that they describe with strategic vagueness as brain fog. This was in 2014, this was written. Now that's much more in the parlance, obviously. In Chen's experience, this includes the fog around migraines, around smoking weed, and around a certain inability to read or think as a kid that they describe as feeling stupid. One of the points Chen makes is how completely such states of cognitive density transgress the demands of academic work and their cognitive toolset, taxonomies, namings, retrievals. Ultimately, Chen writes, the academic institutions we inhabit are at this moment adept at producing what I would call disciplined cognators. What happens to us in that process? While Chen is clear about the racializing equivalencies of cognitive states, one of the larger points they make is that these experiences of cognition blurring offer an interesting conceptual standpoint from which to work, not least because no one is cognitively clear all the time. In other words, in addition to questioning the kind of cognitive subjects we're being compelled to habitually become, if also failing to be, these cognitive blurs have constructive epistemological possibilities too. For me, the epistemological possibilities of brain fog, and then sometimes literally fevered unreason, included being suspended from linear sequential time, the kind of time that modern historical work implies and demands. Pain just wipes out your sense of time. Linear sequential universalizing time, as many have pointed out, is also colonial time. So with fog and fever and pain, I was actually relieved of that reality construction in some ways. Related to this, I could not disentangle the Christian imperialism I was living and the Christian imperialism I was studying. Not because I was tracing lineages or analyzing ideological structures, not mostly anyway. Rather, I was experiencing it all in this kind of surreal fashion. Late ancient history appeared unpredictably in the quirky, intimate details of my daily life, and the social structures before me as they played out with immediacy and in real time, fragmentarily, as if under this shell I picked up at the beach. I found this gripping, even if I found it hard to explain using my usual scholarly apparatus. I did end up shaping it into a kind of a whole, like a manuscript of sorts, but I offer this rendition of my experience not to make some sort of example of myself, since my experiments with form before, including, and after that manuscript are piecemeal, and they're ongoing and they're unresolved, as one might expect. So my experience is only subjective, suggestive. It's also subjective. The reason I situate my experience with this work in cultural studies, though, is that so that we might attune ourselves to the ways our cognitive operations and perceptive habits, the very fundamental ways we do our thinking business, are heavy with exclusions. Thus, their interruptions become meaningful. I also want to attune us to the ways that apparently non-ideal cognitive or ostensibly pathological states can be understood as epistemologically rich because they are epistemologically difficult. These states of mind or habits of perception offer an escape hatch from the contentification and commodification of thought, with their ability to gum up or slow down, even briefly, the content machines. And their difficulty might very well return us to the lively, processual forms of thinking because they don't necessarily produce easily harvested information or endlessly replicable models. In fact, these non-ideal states and otherwise habits of perception need to be valued precisely for their difficulty, for their uselessness, to borrow from Manning's title. In other words, to be attuned to these racial, colonial, pathologizing dynamics, the modalities in which we do our thinking, is to feel unsettled in and with the regular forms of academic writing. Because the force of these forms, because of the impoverishing work they do, it is incumbent upon us to see what exactly we can do without, by bending them, pressing on them, letting them bleed at the edges, and see where they break. But it's also incumbent upon us to seek out and invent forms of historical and critical work that reflect the complexity of life, which includes not only, but inevitably, a mix of cognitive conditions and emotional states, forms of perception, and relationships to debility, disability, and impairment. So I'll end with this. We can't do the ethical work we want to do without addressing the problem of form, since form is, again, not only the shape of our habits of thinking, but the form our relations take. I would even argue here that there will be no real foundational changes in our disciplinary epistemologies without a proliferation of forms. Not simply a diversity of style, not more variegated content to satisfy various content appetites, but a proliferation of difficult, unfinished experiments in thinking through and thinking with. Experiments that move with the frictive force of life as it is lived, including in its manifold departures from the reasoned, categorical, lucid, and executive mind. Thanks.